Hi and welcome. A new version of the explan tool is out and available for download. If you don't know what explan is, it's a simple SQL Plus script for analyzing a single SQL execution in detail. So it provides a lot of details about a single SQL execution. If you want to find out more about it, you can search for the previous tutorials that show you how to use explan and what explan is about. In the new version, you have a simplified usage. You have new features like real-time SQL monitoring information is now included. You have a complete coverage of session activity, which is important in case of recursive SQL activity or if other cursors are active during the execution of another SQL ID. And many other improvements that include also improved performance, because the previous version of explan introduced some complex processing for the hash data, and I've improved the performance of these queries, which is important if you have to analyze a huge amount of active session history samples, like 100,000 or millions of samples. And the new version is tested with 12c, and the previous version had actually some problems with 12c because there were some minor changes, and therefore I had to adjust the script slightly to work properly with 12c. Let's have a brief look at the simplified usage of the new explan version. If you call explan you can specify different options at the command line. The first thing that has changed with the new version is that the parameters have been reordered. There are two different modes of explan One is related to active session history analysis, and the other mode is related to row source statistics. By default, I assume that the most common usage of explan will be the active session history mode. Therefore, the active session history related parameters come now first, and the row source statistics related parameters come now last. The second thing that has changed is that you can now abbreviate most of the parameters, where you have to type in different options, so you don't have to deal with the long version of these options, and it's also doesn't matter if it's typed in lower or uppercase. Let's make an example here. I want to copy and paste some of these parameters here from the active session history, and one other thing that has changed is that you can now use different date formats for the SQL exec start. In previous releases you had to follow exactly the date mask specified here. Of course, you could change that in the script so that the default date mask is different, but you had to stick to this single date mask. Now multiple date masks are supported. I could, for instance, simply copy and paste this date format here, although it's not corresponding to the default date mask specified here. explan supports multiple, and I hope I've covered the most commonly used date masks, but you can easily maintain and update this list in the script if you like. And let's just paste some other stuff here, and then here, as I said, you can abbreviate. If I want to use the mixed option here, I can simply specify a lower m, or here I can specify a lower y, and so on, or you can even here specify the parameters in a different order, just the first character. That should be fine, and explan should get it right. So let's just execute this here and have a brief look what explan has understood from the options. So the first thing that we can see is this date format was understood. So you can see here that it used the correct SQL exec start information, and also these parameters here that were used, these abbreviated ones, were the correct ones that were now used. So that should ease the usage of explan further. And now let's have a look at the other new features. The first thing that I want to show is the recursive activity. For that purpose, I've just executed this simple query here that makes use of a user-defined PL SQL function that in turn runs a recursive SQL, so that we actually get in the active session history different SQL IDs during the execution of the main SQL here. So if we look at the real-time SQL monitoring report, in the overview for that execution, we do not see really an obvious sign that recursive activity was involved. But if we check the activity tab here, we get a clear indication that some other SQL ID was here involved. And the real-time SQL monitoring information, the instrumentation that it is based on, can clearly separate between recursive SQL IDs that belong to this main SQL ID and maybe other SQL IDs, other cursors that were active that do not belong to this SQL ID. But in active session history, there is no clear relation between the SQL IDs. The only information that you have is a top-level SQL ID, but in case of multiple levels of recursion, then this is something that is not that obvious from active session history. You cannot really tell which SQL IDs belong together, which one are recursive activity of another one. For that reason, the previous version of explan did have basically not a complete coverage of such scenarios. We can see here, if we do an analysis of this SQL ID, of the SQL execution of the SQL ID with the old version of explan, then you see here it was approximately active for 70 seconds, but it was within the 70 seconds it was only active for 40 seconds. So we have on an indicator of average active sessions per second less than 1. And if we look at the activity timeline, we can see here this clear sign of gaps of activity where no active samples for the SQL ID analyzed were found. But the point is that from this report, from this information, you simply cannot tell whether the session did something else during this time, whether the session was actually idle and waiting for application activity. So that wasn't obvious. So the new version of explan therefore introduces a different approach. So we can, with more meaningful column headings, we can now see here in the new version that we still have this gap in that there was significant that there's a significant difference between these 70 seconds of total duration where samples were found, but within this 70 seconds only 40 seconds of activity were found. So that's not different from the old release. But now if explan finds any other activity of this same session, then you will get this other activity information, and in this case we can see that 29 other samples of activity were found, so that in total we can see here this 0.6 average active sessions for this SQL ID, and we see here 0.4 average active sessions for the remaining other activity of this session. We see here we now have a complete coverage in this case of the sessions activity, and you get in the case any activity is found here, you even get a detailed breakdown of which SQL IDs, if there was a SQL ID, if there's no SQL ID found, then you will get a null SQL ID information. You get a complete information about the details of this other activity, and we can see here that in this case that this idea that was the SQL ID that was found here in the real-time SQL monitoring report, you will also find here in this other activity details. And in this particular case, we can even use this top-level SQL ID to see the relation to the main SQL ID that we're looking at. But as I said, in more complex scenarios where you have multiple levels of recursion, this top-level SQL ID cannot be relied on to understand whether this is recursive activity or not. Yeah, so that's means that with this version of explan you have a complete coverage of activity on the system during the execution of this main SQL ID. You get the summary of the activity of this main SQL ID. You get any other activity of this session shown in these two sections if there is any, and you get, like you get in the previous version, you get this concurrent activity information where any other sessions that were active during this execution are also summarized, so that you have a complete picture of what happened during the SQL execution of the main SQL ID. Note that still in this version, the activity timeline will still show these gaps, because this activity timeline shows only information about the main SQL ID, but you get an idea about the other activity in this other activity information, where you, for instance, have also this time active graph where it shows you when this other activity was active during the execution of the main SQL ID. Another main improvement of explan is the real-time SQL monitoring information that is now included. For that purpose, I ran here a different SQL, and the real-time SQL monitoring report for that execution looks like this here. We can see here that it's a parallel execution because we have spent more database time than we have the actual duration, so multiple processes were active during this execution. And you have here this overview section in the official real-time SQL monitoring report, and you basically get the same overview in the explan output if you request real-time SQL monitoring information and it is available, which is controlled via this monitor command line parameter. Then you get multiple new sections that cover real-time SQL monitoring information. It starts with this real-time SQL monitoring summary, which corresponds to this overview here. So you get an information about parallel execution. You get this cheap imitation of this duration and database time graph, which basically supposed to correspond to these two graphs here. So that you see that this is parallel execution because the duration in relation to the database time is much smaller. And you also get here a breakdown, a graphical breakdown of the different types of activity, which corresponds to what you see here. You have the I/O stuff, you have the CPU, we have 5 minutes of database time, 55 seconds of CPU time, almost 3 minutes of I/O time, and so on and so on. So that's all the same information that you get from this overview here. If in case of PL SQL Java time, you get it also here. The I/O overview, like the logical I/O, the physical I/O, cell offload percentage if you have an Exadata system, and maybe even an error message in case there was some error that you would also get from the report here. One thing that you do not get that obvious from the official report is this section here. It simply calls this here degree of parallelism, but in fact internally this is called maximum degree, because you can have multiple degrees in a single parallel execution, which is something that the official report doesn't make that obvious. One indicator here that should alarm you a little bit is that although we have a maximum degree of 15 found in the report, we have actually requested and allocated 46 parallel execution servers. Now if you think about two sets of 15, which should be the maximum that you get for a degree of 15, which means 30 parallel execution servers, you might wonder how you arrive at 46 parallel execution servers. So that's one of the things that you do not get from the official report. Actually, you do get it in case of downgrades. There is some more information shown here in this section where it shows you the actual number of servers requested and allocated, but I show this information always in order to make you aware of that there might have happened something unusual, like in this case here. As I said, you should at maximum have 30 parallel execution servers, so something should make you wonder what happened here. So that's the reason why this information is included. Then another area where you get specific output from real-time SQL monitoring is the part here, which are the actual bind values. If bind variables were included, this is something that you would get from the report here in this part, and it's straightforward, just the same, which can be very handy if you see the actual bind values, and that's the reason why it's also included in explan. And of course, on execution plan line level, you get a lot of additional information. If real-time SQL monitoring information is available, you basically get all these new columns here, which weren't available in the previous version, which correspond to the most important information here from the official report, which is the number of executions, the actual cardinality, the PGA memory allocation, the temp space allocation, and the I/O amount, reads and writes of physical I/O, which should basically be the same in this case here to the official report, though, so there shouldn't be much difference between the two because it's based on the same information. One thing that is nice with explan is that you get the actual cardinality not only on execution plan line level, but you get it also on process level in case of parallel execution. So you can easily spot here problems with the data distribution. You can, for example, see here that multiple processes were involved and the distribution of data looks quite nice, so that every process was more or less working on the same amount of data, whereas you can easily spot here that this single process had to work on the complete amount of data for that execution plan line. So here obviously something went wrong with the data distribution, and that information on process level is something that you do not get from the official real-time SQL monitoring report, although it is actually available from the underlying view information from the instrumentation. It's there, but it's not shown in the official report. And in 12c it is to some degree you can get that information, but you have to start clicking through the report and choose different options, and it's not that obvious, not in the same way obvious like it is in here in explan. So you have the in parentheses you get the number of samples, and in brackets you get, if it's available, the actual cardinality on process level. Another nice thing with this real-time SQL monitoring information included in explan is the fact that you get this level of information also from previous versions like 11.1. This report here, this type of report, this active report, was only available, was introduced with 11.2, so you didn't get this level of information in 11.1 simply because the corresponding report wasn't available. In fact, most of the information, however, is available already in 11.1 from the underlying views, and this is nice that explan gives you basically the same amount of information that you get from the active report in 11.2 you can also get in 11.1, including the information like the cardinality on process level, which is something, as I said, you do not even get in 11.2. And also you get this activity timeline information here from explan in 11.1, which is something that corresponds to this activity graph here. Again, this is something that you do not get in the 11.1 SQL monitoring report because this active version is simply not available in that 11.1 release. So that is a nice side effect of explan that it supports now real-time SQL monitoring info, that you get much more details in previous releases than you get from the official reports. And finally, something that you also now get in this version of explan is the simple parallel execution skew indicator on execution plan line level. That's again something that you do not get from the official real-time SQL monitoring reports, not even in 12c. So you get in a simple graph indicator which execution plan lines were involved in parallel execution skew, so that you will get a very good understanding which parts of the execution plan line you need to focus on for understanding what went wrong with the parallel execution work distribution. Finally, I just want to point out that if you want to understand all the changes that have been introduced with the latest version, I can only recommend to look into the header of the script, because I have a changelog here that specifies in many details what has changed here in this version. You can see here this changelog that also shows it for the previous releases, so you get, if you read through that, you get a good idea what kind of features you can get from the new version, what has been added, and also you get here a nice overview of the different options and what they mean, and which options do control what output of the script.